Is G7 really relevant in today's times? Are there any alternatives to G7 and what can we expect? These seven countries, major developed economies, they represented more than 60% of the global GDP. Donald Trump has been continuously talking about taking over Canada as a 51st state. Hello and welcome to Rahul Verse. In today's video lecture, we are going to discuss about G7, the group of seven nations. We are going to raise a question, is G7 really relevant today? Why are we having this discussion? Because in the upcoming days, we are looking at 51st annual summit of G7 nations. The G7 summit, annual summit is going to happen this year in Canada, which has the presidency. The summit is taking place at Kananaskis in Alberta. From June 15th to June 17th, all eyes are on this G7 meet, where not just the group of seven countries, but other invitees have also been called. A very late invitation has also gone to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who will be attending this summit. But in today's video lecture, we'll first understand what is this G7, we'll understand the history of G7, and then we'll try to answer the question, is G7 really relevant in today's times? Are there any alternatives to G7 and what can we expect? Let's begin our discussion. As I told you, G7 is a group of seven nations. However, it began as G6 initially in 1975, and this year it is the 50th anniversary of G7. It began in 1975 with 6 states. So initially it started as G6 in 1975. The very next year, Canada joined it in 1976. However, G7 has not remained G7 forever. In 1998, at the behest of the then US President Bill Clinton, Russia was inducted into G7 and it became formally G8. So from 1998 till 2014, Russia was also a part of this grouping, which was called G8. So this represents a group of developed economies. So today, when we talk about G7 countries, these are the group, or this is a cabal or a group of countries which are economically strong, which are developed economies. Now, when you look at the membership today, it has 7 members: France, United States of America, UK, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Canada. From exam point of view, especially for UPSC civil services aspirants, it's always good to remember the membership of these small groupings. And again, from my side, one of my shortcuts during my preparation days was I used to remember them through the acronyms. Juice, GF, right? This E is England, that's it. Japan, USA, Italy, Canada, England or UK, and then there is GF, that is ground floor, Germany and France. So try to remember these 7 members. Today, these are the 7 members. At one point of time, Russia was also the member here. It's not just the 7 countries. Please remember that G7 countries are the industrialized Western countries, but during the annual summit, they also invite other guest countries. And India has been attending previous G7 meets from 2019. It has been getting a continuous invite, which is a testimony to the growing might of India. Although in 2020, the year of COVID, it was a virtual summit. India did attend at that time also, but from 2019 continuously, India has been invited. Indian Prime Minister has been attending. And this year also, the invitation did come very late, owing to the strained relationship between India and Canada. But the Indian Prime Minister is going to attend this summit as well. Apart from India, earlier Australia, South Korea and other democracies have been invited. European Union has been participating fully in G7 summit since 1981 as non-enumerated member. So it's not just the G7 countries, but they also called guest countries, and India has been one of the countries which is being invited from last few years continuously. Now question comes, okay sir, I understood about G7, I understood about the history of G7. Now question that's in front of us is it really relevant today? Now you must be thinking, so why are we talking about relevancy of G7? It looks like a very important grouping because it consists of 7 countries which are industrialized, which are developed. But if you look closely, G7 has been losing relevance. One of the first ideas of G7 is it does not have a secretariat. It's not a formal institution. I would say when you look at some other organizations, say for example NATO. NATO has its secretariat, but Group of Seven, the G7 nations, it's not very formal institution. It does not have any charter. There is no charter. There is no secretariat of G7. The presidency of G7, it rotates every year. Every member takes up the presidency. They set up the agenda. They are responsible for the summits, and they are responsible for all the logistical support for other attendees as well. So every year one country takes the mantle and they set the agenda without any formal charter of G7. So this itself calls a question that G7, perhaps it needs a charter. It maybe needs a secretariat, a permanent secretariat, right? The next point is the threat. When you look at the G7, as I told you, it was not G7 perpetually. Initially, it started as G6, later it became G7 in 1976. Then, for a short period of time, from 1998 to 2014, Russia was inducted, right? Russia was a part and parcel of this grouping of developed economies. But Russia was expelled out in 2014 when it annexed Crimea, and since then it has been G7. Now, there is a constant challenge to these developed economies, the Western developed economies, from Russia, not just from Russia-China axis in recent times. That makes, or that brings the question, is G7 really relevant in front of these? On the flip side, you can argue with me that one of the strong point for G7's survival, or one of the areas of convergence for G7, I would say, is because of these countries, that is China and Russia. The challenge from China and Russia, see, the challenge from Moscow and Beijing has also been a major point of convergence for the G7 countries. Now, in some time, we are going to understand, when you talk about G7 countries, we mention them as the Western democracies, and there is a misconception in all our heads that these democracies might be coordinating properly. These democracies might be on the same page when it comes to global issues, but it's not. Despite all these divergences, there are some points of convergence for G7, especially when you look at countering China and Russia. So G7 has imposed coordinated sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine war, and they have also been a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. So we can say that these are some of the mini achievements of G7. And yes, I can say that Russia was a part and parcel of the grouping. Now it is not there. These two are also a rallying force for the G7 as well. Okay. Now, apart from this, there are certain other questions. Okay. Now, this pointer may not be that strong for you, but if you look at the clout of these major G7 countries or major economies, it has been continuously coming down. If you look at this particular graph, you'll understand G7 was set up in 1975, and at that point of time, these 7 countries, major developed economies, they represented more than 60% of the global GDP. But over a period of time, you will see that their economic clout declining continuously, and by 2025 they represent around 40%, 43% around 2021. Today even less, because there are other players emerging continuously. China and India being the two important emerging powers whose economic clout is also increasing. So one can say that G7 and their economies are slowly and steadily losing relevance. The other players are coming up, and that is why there is a question on the existence of G7. The next pointer would be G7 is not united, as I told you. By the name itself, you feel that it might be a small grouping, so just 7 countries sitting together and taking decisions very quickly. On paper, it might look that these are in unison, or there might be decisions through unanimity, but that is not the case. If you dissect this G7 grouping, you will find that there are so many internal disagreements over trade and over the climate policies, especially since the coming of Donald Trump as US president for the second term. We had seen a similar trend during Donald Trump's first term as well. Let me give you some examples of these divergences. When you look at the membership, Donald Trump has been continuously talking about taking over Canada as a 51st state. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, when he met Donald Trump recently, he said that Canada is not for sale. And Trump responded by saying, never say never. And initially, we all thought it might be a joke that Donald Trump is talking about Canada being 51st state of USA, but he sounded quite serious. So there is a divergence between USA and Canada over this issue. Not just this, when you look at other things, right? Recently, there was a major gaffe from Donald Trump when he said that it is because of Trudeau. Again, Trudeau is not in power right now. It's Mark Carney right now. Trump said Trudeau wrongly pushed Russia out of G8 in 2018. And according to Donald Trump, if Russia were in the G8 grouping, the Ukraine war would not have taken place. This itself shows a divergence of thought process among the G7 countries, many of which are European nations who are threatened continuously by Russia, right? Next, if you look at Trump, Trump gives the idea that Russia should be readmitted into G7, and this was at the beginning of 2025. The players, that is the members in G7, they are not on the same page when it comes to inducting Russia back into G7 fold. Let's see what happens in this year's summit. Then, if you look at the stance, if you look at the initial communique that came up, Trump's stance on Ukraine, Trump's stance on climate change, it completely derails the joint communique. Generally, what happens after the G7 summit, at the beginning also there is a communique, and at the end there are statements, and those statements are a combined statement from nations. But this time around, there is already a divergence in thought. Donald Trump's policies are well known when it comes to WHO, well known when it comes to climate change, well known when it comes to Ukraine. He runs a country as if he's running a business, and that is where the divergence is coming between G7 countries, between the other G7 partners and United States of America. And this year, the G7 leaders, they might not aim to attempt, or they might not attempt to reach an agreement at the June 15 to June 17 summit, and let's see what will happen in the summit. All these pointers, they boil down to a question: is G7 really relevant? There is so much of media hype over G7. Now, when you look at some other things in terms of internal divisions, there are many people who believe that G7, it's a grouping of the democracies, it's a grouping of advanced economies. It would be rather incomplete without the emerging players. For instance, Jim O'Neill, the person who gave the term BRIC, according to him, he believes that G7 would be irrelevant if it excludes the emerging powers like India and China. So there are many foreign policy experts, many international relations experts, they highlight that there is a possibility that G20 may be better than G7. Why? Because G7 itself is going through a lot of internal contradictions, especially since the coming of Donald Trump as President of the United States of America. So the power and prestige of G20 has been continuously increasing because it has become a forum of finance ministers and the central bank governors, and they played a very important role during the 2008 financial crisis, 2013 crisis, and recently during 2020 COVID-19 crisis as well. Why? Because G20 includes the emerging powers. It includes emerging powers like Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and there is also representation to Africa. Some experts believe that G20 might be a better grouping with a good representation in comparison to G7. Why? Because G20 represents 85% of the global GDP powers, not just 40% of the power in terms of the GDP contribution at the global level. Some believe that there might be a possibility of another grouping or expansion of the G7 grouping. In fact, these ideas are in news since last 4 to 5 years. In fact, former Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson, he was the one who floated the idea of D10, that is Democracy 10, by involving India also in it. And Trump had suggested not just D10 but D11 or G11. He wanted to include Russia also in it. So some experts highlight that G7 would become relevant if it expands and if it includes other players into it. UK's idea of D10, that might be a good alternative to G7, but there are also challenges to G7. For instance, BRICS. It is becoming a very sound alternative to G7 because BRICS has been continuously evolving, continuously developing. BRICS has already become, BRIC became BRICS, and now I don't want to name what exactly it is because the terminology is BRICS, which was the symbolism for the countries which were involved in this. But now there is a continuous expansion. 2024 and 2025 has seen a lot of expansion of BRICS, where it has given representation to Africa. There is representation to UAE. Indonesia has joined recently. So some foreign policy experts believe that BRICS is a better alternative to G7. Whatever is the answer to this question, is G7 relevant or not? You do let me know in the comment section whether it is relevant or not, or there are good alternatives to it, or there is a need of expansion to it. But one thing is for certain, this summit, which is going to happen in Canada, in Alberta this year, is going to be one of the important summits where everybody will be looking at G7. Why? Because Donald Trump is abandoning global leadership. So if global leadership by USA is being taken back, or a step back has been one of the ideas of United States of America administration, then G7 must address this vacuum, or this leadership vacuum can be taken over by G7, and what happens in the G7 summit will be looked at very closely because they are at the crossroads. Why? US policies are quite divergent when it comes to world health, when it comes to the climate change crisis, when it comes to green energy, and G7 decisions and G7 leadership is needed very much at this point of time, and maybe in future expansion of G7 can be expected on the cards. So let's see what happens in this year's G7 summit. We'll be keeping an eye on it, and whenever development occurs, we'll have a discussion on Rahul verse. Thank you for watching this video, and if you want to connect with me, you can connect with me on this particular number. If you want to follow me on social media, this is my social media ID @RahulSai222. This is my Instagram ID where you can follow me and you can directly send a message there as well. So thank you for watching this video again. Jai Hind.